morning. First of all, I'd like to thank Daphne for planning the service and communicating to us so well. And as she said, as we met for prayer before the service this morning, it's amazing how things have come together as she's planned the service, and I agree. I'll probably talk about some of the things we've already sung about this morning, which I didn't know we were going to sing. But the theme today is Hold On to God's Vision. And this song is a metaphor. It's a vision that the prophet Ezekiel had. And it's a vision that he had. Ezekiel was one of the major prophets. There's major prophets and minor prophets. I always wonder what the difference was between the two. Well, the major prophets, they all wrote books that are in the Bible. Most of the books in the Bible are named after the prophets. The ones that are the longest, 5 longest ones are the major prophets, and the ones that said the least are the minor prophets. I found that out. I really no different, but they all were spokespersons for God. And they're given ordinary spiritual gifts and moral insights. A prophet could give both encouragement and often rebuke and need for repentance. A prophet back then was considered the final authority on God. Ezekiel had the gift of visions. And the story, the vision he had about the dry bones was a vision that he had. And Ezekiel was born in Israel, but he was captured by the Babylonians when he was about 25 years old. And he worked as a slave in Babylon. And when he was about 30 years old, about the same age that Jesus began his ministry, Ezekiel felt the call to his ministry. And like most prophets, he wasn't always accepted. The words they had, and talk about words, sometimes words can be very, very powerful. I know that when people have spoken words of encouragement today, and I can remember words that people spoke many years ago when I was young. People spoke about me. It made a difference in my life. And there have been positive and negative words that's been spoken to me. I can remember both. I remember a baseball coach one time coming from Appalachia. We always said, yeah this and yeah that. And the baseball coach, we lived in Dayton for a year. Baseball coach took me aside. He said, you don't know how to speak right. He said, oh, yes, not yeah. But I remember that. I didn't like the coach that well after that. But anyway, we have many teachers here, and I know words. As I was preparing for this, I thought about how people's words have affected me. I know we've been people who have been attracted to church here by the words that people say to them, warm words that people say to them, and people have left on the opposite side. But Nebuchadnezzar was the king of the land at that time, and he had the mighty army, and they drove Israel into Babylon. And there was a prophet in Israel named Jeremiah that was a prophet about the same time, almost exactly the same time as Ezekiel was. So Ezekiel prophesied or shared this vision he had from God about the dry bones. They both prophesied of the destruction of Israel, but then the coming back of Israel, the rise of Israel, the destruction of Jerusalem and Syria, but then the rise again. And that's what the song is about. And they both shared their visions. One of the visions, which you've heard quite a few times, I'm sure, was a prophecy given by the prophet Jeremiah. He says, God gave him these words. He said, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you." Of course, the greatest prophet of all was Jesus. And after Jesus was baptized, he went into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. And after he was in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, he went back to the synagogue where he grew up, and he asked for the prophet, as was the custom then, asked for the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and unrolling it, he found the place where it was written. These are words from Isaiah that Jesus read as he began his ministry. And these are what many people consider this to be Jesus' vision, which came from God. So the Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom from the prisoners and recovery of sight to the blind. To set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendants, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him because he spoke with so much authority. And they began, this couldn't be. This is the son of Joseph. Nothing from their town, nothing good ever came from where he's from. And Jesus started, something angered Jesus, evidently. And he said, surely you will quote this proverb to me, physician, heal yourself. And you will tell me, do here in your hometown what we have heard that you did in Capernaum. Truly, Jesus said, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time. Elijah was another prophet. He said, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years and there was severe famine throughout the land, Elijah was sent not to any of the Israelites, but Elijah was sent to a widow in Zarephath in the region. And then he said there are many in Israel with leprosy at the time of Elijah the prophet, yet none of them were cleansed except for Naaman the Syrian. So this angered the people. They chased him out of the temple, drove him out of the temple, and took him to the top of a hill on which the town was built in order to throw him off of a cliff. But he walked through the crowd and went on his way. Jesus' mission was just not for the salvation of the Israelites. Jesus' mission was for the salvation of all people, And in the scriptures, Paul wrote in Galatians, there's neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male or female, for you are all in one in Christ Jesus. We are all God's children, and Jesus' vision was that we take care of each other. We love each other just like any other parent would want. They want their children to get along. And I think most of us, they want their children to be healthy. They want their children to get along. We of the church have been challenged by the president of our church to be prophetic. So what does that mean? What's it mean to be prophetic? And to me, I heard, well, it's not for the prophets, it's for us to be prophetic. We're all called to be prophetic. So I'd like to give you a couple examples of prophetic people. First of all, I'd like to read a book. David Jeremiah wrote a book. It's called Forward. It's Discovering God's Presence and Purpose for Your Tomorrow. It's a book on how we can be prophetic. So I'd like to go to a couple examples, people no doubt you've heard of throughout your life who were prophetic. First one was Annie Sullivan. Have you heard of Annie Sullivan? I think most of you had. When she was 5 years old, she had a destructive eye disease called trachoma. Her vision got progressively worse. On top of that, she lived in poverty and physical abuse from her father. Her family come from Ireland, come from Europe, and they were poor, and they had 3 children. And then the wife, I forget her name, she died when the children were young of TB. A few years later, her brother died of TB 4 years later, so he gave up the other 2. He said he couldn't raise them. and they were sent to what was called an almshouse. Almshouse, which was for pregnant women, unwed mothers, basically women. So that's the only place they could find for Annie. And they had to close down the almshouse because it wasn't run very well, wasn't funded very well, and they had all kind of problems. So finally they closed it down. Well, the authority that was responsible for closing it down was also responsible for placing the people in there, and she was placed. And he had a discussion with her, told her what you wanted to do. She said she wanted to learn how to read. And so at 14 years old, he found a place for her. It was called the Perkins School for the Deaf. It was in Massachusetts. For the deaf, I mean, not for the dead, for the deaf. And so she was sent to Perkins School for the Blind, where she learned to read and write. She graduated at the age of 20 and was about valedictorian. And here was the end of the graduation speech that she gave. It was titled Happiness. And she said, "Fellow graduates, duty bids us go forth into an active life. Let us go cheerfully, hopefully, and earnestly, and set ourselves to find our especial part, to find our own purpose, to find our own vision. When we have found it, willingly and faithfully perform it. For every obstacle we overcome, every success we achieve, tends to bring man closer to God and make life more as He would have it. We found our purpose, when we found our vision, said it will make life easier, not only for you, but as God would have it." So later in life, later another person was Helen Keller, which Annie Sullivan. Helen Keller was born in, I forget, it's not Tuscaloosa, Alabama. That's the one you hear about, but it sounds like that, from Alabama. And her father was a former slave owner. They had a plantation, and they had wealth. When Helen Keller was born, she was born, when she was born at 19 months, she come up with some kind of disease that affected her hearing and her sight. So she was not only deaf, but she was blind. So her father, who had some means, was searching for a teacher for her. So he searched all over the place for her and couldn't find a place. Finally, he discovered Perkins School for the Blind, and that's where Annie Sullivan was teaching. And so the school recommended that he hire Annie Sullivan. And so Annie Sullivan went to Alabama to live with Helen Keller, the Keller family. But they didn't get along at all. She didn't like him. He was a former slave, and she didn't like him, and he didn't like her. So, but he saw the results that she was getting. It was like within 6 months, she learned how to read. She recognized 576 words. And so he couldn't deny the fact that she was learning to read. Annie Sullivan used all the modern Braille and all the modern techniques for speaking. So he decided, she recommended Annie go back with her to the school, Perkins School for the Blind. So he didn't really want her to go with Annie, but he decided that would be the best thing for her. He could see the results. So she went back to school. She not only graduated from school, she went to college, and I thought I had it written down, but the name of a really bright girl from our high school, the brightest probably person that ever went to my high school, went to Radcliffe, I think it is. It was in the area of Harvard. The women's equivalent of Harvard was Radcliffe, so that's where she went. And she also graduated from college. She became the first person with deaf and blind to graduate from college. And she went on to be, she wrote 14 books, hundreds of essays and speeches. Her most famous work was The Story of My Life, published in 1903. Detailed her life and education with Annie Sullivan. Annie Sullivan and Helen Keller became lifelong friends. They traveled together because Helen Keller spoke all over the world. And sometimes, because I remember she died, Helen Keller died in 1968, so like you, some of you have heard her speeches and heard her talk. She was difficult to understand, so sometimes Annie Sullivan would speak for Helen Keller. But she went on to be a founding member. She was a spokesperson for disabilities, women's suffrage, and labor rights. She was a founding member of the American Civil Rights Union, ACLU, and campaigned for social justice and equality. And she had a major voice in our country that people listened to, and she spoke with power and authority. And what did Helen Keller say about vision? She said, the only thing worse than being blind is having sight but not having any vision. Having sight but not having any vision. And there is a difference. Helen Keller passed away in 1968, but her legacy as a trailblazer for the disabled for the community, and her advocacy for social change continue to inspire many generations. There's a saying that I've heard, I think that applies to them and probably us. It says, when the student is ready, a teacher will appear. When the student is ready, the teacher will appear. If we're ready to receive, God has many, many blessings for us through other people. When I look back on my life, I can see that I've had many mentors in my life. I know Mom and Dad, I didn't like it, but Mom and Dad, we had to be to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and any other activities. I remember when I was in high school, I think I was around 17, I told my dad, I said, I think I'm old enough to make decisions on my own now. He said, yeah, you can make decisions. You don't have to come to district conference, which sometimes was Friday night, Saturday night, and Sunday. So I decided I wasn't going that weekend. I got in Mom's car and started driving around. The next day, he sold Mom's car. So I could make my decision, but I had to pay for some of those bad decisions. But they did. They guided me in the right decision. They made many, many sacrifices for me that I didn't realize at the time were sacrifices, and they did it willingly. They were committed to Jesus Christ. To them, it wasn't a sacrifice. If you're committed to Christ, it's not a sacrifice. It's not a burden. And we didn't know, but at that time, I know I had people that influenced me much more now, as I recognize now, much more than I realized then. We was at church one Wednesday evening, and at that time, it was not unusual for some of the older people to speak in tongues, to speak in visions. And one lady spoke up, I'd been in her home. I'd gone with my dad to her home many times to pray for her. And we had several older people, and he took usually one of the three older ones. We traveled with Dad quite a bit, and to pray for him. Dad was a pastor, and I never saw the use of being pastor. I looked at it selfishly, and I saw all the sacrifice that they were making, but they didn't consider it sacrifice. So like many preachers' kids, I didn't want anything to do with the church. But still, I knew I had a calling, but I ran away from the calling. I was in church one Wednesday night, and a lady had a vision, stood up. Her name was Carrie Tolbert. And she said, I had a vision of Dad walking through the snow with his boots on, and I was following him. I knew what that vision meant, but I thought that I didn't really want that for my life. And when I was called to be office of deacon as a teenager, my dad accepted for me. Joe Williams was the pastor at the time from Southern Ohio, and I was still in bed on a Sunday morning. He called me from church, and he told me what I'd been called to a deacon. I was thinking to myself, I didn't know it. I must have been thinking out loud, and I said, well, how can I refuse? And I meant that literally. Well, Joe took it figuratively. So I went down, and so Dad he told everyone what I said. And I never went to the meetings where they approved anything. I went down for Christmas one year, and they said I was going to be ordained. That's how they did it back then, I guess. So, but that's kind of how they did it in the early days of priesthood. But I accepted it 5 years before I even offered a prayer. I did other things. I was gladly willing to do other things, but I didn't want to speak in front of people. It was 5 years for me to really start to accept that calling. But I had people that were around that were so nurturing with me. And I'd go to church, and a lot of people are still here from that time. That was over 50 years ago, believe it or not. And everyone was so friendly and so accepting. I gradually got more and more involved. One time I went to church. Herschel put the schedule out, and I was on the schedule to speak. And I said, Herschel, we made a mistake here. That's not right. He said, no. He said, it's your time. But anyway, Herschel and the pastor, I remember many of the people aren't where Joe's here today. I know Judy's here, but Jerry Glandon was pastor. Herschel was a pastor. Bob Gooden was a pastor for a while. And their families, they were so accepting, so loving. And the one that probably had the most effect on me was Bob and Lucinda. Bob and Lucinda Madden, they didn't have any children, but they considered all of us their children. And they were very accepting on us and made a big difference in my life. And so Bob, a few years before he died, Bob gave me his record. Some called him Emmett, but he gave me his records, all the history of the church, and many records and many personal things. He ran track for Ohio State, believe it or not. And he was an engineer. His professional engineer worked for Jeffrey Manufacturing. I think his proudest thing was he worked on the Hoover Dam. Back then, the Hoover Dam was almost considered like a miracle. And I just looking recently, I've been going for trying to get rid of some stuff at home, but I found some of his records. One was his business card, and it had I didn't even know he lived in New York. Business card from New York, had the address in New York City, so evidently he had an office in New York City. And on the back of his card, it was kind of interesting, it was like a picture of Jesus, and they used to write, I forget what they called it, but they had a picture of Jesus, Christian things, Christian symbols on the back of his business card. But anyway, I'm always a person with numbers, and he kept meticulous records. Joe's not here today, but he had records. Well, Joe's upstairs, but he had records, and the one I liked the best, he even kept a record of mowing his grass. He had little books, how high he mowed the grass that day and the date and when he treated the lawn. And so Joe mowed his grass in his later years, and Joe mowed his grass. He was upset at Joe because Joe didn't keep in the lines. I used to kid Joe about that, keeping in the lines. But he kept record upon record and record. But one of his records, and each year when I was pastor, he'd make a report. And he had like 15 columns of things that he did. And then this record is 3 pages. Hard to see from there, but each line was a year. And the total of things he did each year. If you total all those numbers up, add them up, he had, there's 15 different things, but the weddings, I think he did almost 100 weddings. I forget the exact number, but counseling sessions, he had like 2,500 counseling sessions. A lot of this stuff came after he retired. He had administrations, I forget the number, but it was in the thousands of administrations. It was unreal. 15 columns of activities over years, and I've always been impressed with numbers, but I've never seen or heard anything like that. But I know that one time when I was asked, in 1982, he had funerals, almost 100 funerals, and he had how many he did each year. He didn't have any in 1981 or 1982 because he had Lou Gehrig's disease. He was in a wheelchair, lost a couple of legs, and so I was asked to do a funeral for a lady who was a nurse, and she took care of Bob and Lucinda, who were founders of our church. She was a nurse that took care of their parents. her husband passed away. And she asked me to do her husband's funeral, which I didn't know. And I went to Bob, and he'd always mentored me, and I said, what do I do? I can't do this. He said, oh, yeah, you can do it. He showed me, told me what to do and how to do it. I said, I'll only do it if you help me out. So he was in a wheelchair, wheeled him in. He told me where to stand at the time, the head of the casket and all that, gave me all the instructions. He offered a couple of the prayers, but that was his last funeral and my first. When he passed away in 1984, we went to the cemetery, and we had just moved into a new house. The World Church had sent me a letter, and John Roberts was district president, brought that letter. He said, you've been called to a high priest. I knew at that time, I'd visited people in the hospital, but just what I realized was my calling at that time was to visit sick people in the hospital, and pray for them. But from that time I knew what my calling was. That came unexpectedly, and you never know when God's going to work with you. But I devoted myself to trying to visit people in prison, people who were sick, and people who needed physical and mental, spiritual blessing. And so the Lord has blessed me. I never saw it as a sacrifice. It was something that I felt like I could do to help. I can remember one time, and I ordered my life, Brother Madden. He was a successful engineer, and he said, I've had many opportunities to advance my career, but he said if I advanced my career, that would have meant I couldn't do what I do for the Lord. And he said, as I look back on him, I said, do you think you made the right decision now? He said, oh, yeah. He said, I know I've made the right decision for the future. So that's where I remember one time Ruth Wemlinger called, and if you remember Ruth, she had a boyfriend, and they lived together for quite a few years, never married, never had any children. Joe took care of her. Joe was the one that took care of her for quite a few years. She had a friend, his name was John. And John's parents, I don't think they liked the arrangement that they had. And they really didn't want much to do with Ruth. So they put him in a nursing home up north. I think it was called Clyde, a small town in northern Ohio. And he was dying. They said he's going to die. And so I asked her, I said, would you like to go? So I closed my business down. And she told me stories that I'd never heard before about our church. And she had a sibling, a younger brother or sister that was sick. And this would have been in the early 1900s. And she said, and back at that time, most of the people burnt coal. It was the cheapest way to heat your house. And the older homes, if you go to the older homes, they got these big gravity furnaces and they'd get their coal from southern Ohio and dump the coal in the basement, and they'd keep the furnace running with coal. So what happened, Columbus always had a cloud over it because of the dust from the coal. And people were dying left and right by black lung disease. And she said that one summer, my doctors told Ruth that she needed to get out of town. It was really bad, especially in the summertime. So they found a cottage or somewhere out in the country. She said, we were all scared because we're from the city. One thing is people from the country, I got relatives from Columbus, are scared to death to stay all night in Columbus. But they were afraid, they were afraid to go to the country. She said, when we got there, she said, a big black dog showed up, and he was with us the whole summer. And when it was time to leave, the day it was time to leave, the dog disappeared. And so I was totally blessed. She said, we grew up, down on the south end of Columbus. We grew up, and we watched when they built the building. She watched, and they built the building in 1922. She said, when we grew up, we as kids watched them build that building, and we said, we want to go there. We want to go to that church. And they did, and as a result, we got Joe, we got the Wimlinger family. She was the whole Wimlinger family. And they live all over the country now. That was the beginning. It was kind of interesting hearing her stories, and I felt truly blessed. But you never know, like the word has been said, the words make a huge difference. I remember when my guidance counselor in high school, for some reason, he was a friend of our family. He took a liking to me, and he asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. I'd never thought about what I wanted to be at all, and just one of those things. I knew I wanted to go to college, so he said, I think you've got a good memory, which I did, and I liked the number. I always liked the numbers. He said, you should be an accountant. I know I didn't listen at first. I started out in engineering, which was a big mistake. I saw the first calculus book, and I didn't got much out of it. Upside down as I was reading it. Made no sense to me. But anyway, I finally came to me that I remember his word from many years ago, earlier, what I should do with my life. But people like him, he encouraged me to do different things in high school. I had teachers. I know one teacher said, you don't have a very good vocabulary. I'm going to give you this book, and we're going to meet every week. I want you to tell me the meaning of these words. So I had 5 words every week to memorize those words and tell what it meant. But it helped me. It really, really helped me. So I've been fortunate to be able, both of those teachers neither one of them were very well accepted people. The lady wore a lot of makeup, and they had a special name for her. And he was different too, but neither one of the people that helped me were very well accepted by the kids in the community. But they took a special interest in me and made a difference in my life. So later on, I know that as I've had choices in my life, whether I could take a promotion or advance in the business world, I remember the words of Brother Madden. He said, yeah, I had those opportunities too when I passed them up so I could serve the Lord. But anyway, I'd like to close. One of our teachers, we read Shakespeare, which I didn't care for any, but there was one poet I liked. His name was Robert Frost, and we had to memorize a couple of his poets. I still remember them, and the only ones I remember, I think, because he liked nature. He wrote, and I still remember a lot of the verses. Walking by the woods on a snowy evening, memorized that thing. Another one I memorized was The Road Not Taken. Again, it's about the woods. That's probably why I remember him. I'd like to read that in closing to you. And like I say, anyway, if you're looking for your purpose, if you're breathing, you still have purpose. And one of the best things you can do for someone is share words of encouragement. So, 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. And be one traveler, long I stood, and looked down as far as I could to where it beneath in the undergrowth. Then took the other just as far, and having perhaps a better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that, the passing there had warned them really about the same, and both that morning equally lay in the leaves. No step had trodden back. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled. It's made all the difference in the world.